So I'm going to ask Tom Baker to introduce our featured speaker, Helen, tonight.
Okay, thank you, Jim. It's my pleasure to introduce Helen Kramer to you. I met her, first of all, through the Peace, Education, and Action for Impact program, which was a pilot last year with young people, groups of young people from 10 different countries around the world. It was 5 weeks of peace education and then 8 weeks of action where they developed a project and delivered that project. And Helen was part of the US cohort team. And Helen has an amazing background. She is currently the assistant director, just promoted to assistant director for the organization called Resetting the Table. And their byline is supporting collaborative deliberations in the face of strong differences. And boy, do we need skills for that, don't we? Because we're facing it all the time. Besides her role before becoming the assistant director was strategy and impact officer at Resetting the Table. And I'll tell you, this young woman has a lot of good strategy and has made a lot of impact through her work. Helen has a bachelor's degree in mathematics with concentration in peace and conflict studies from Oberlin College, and just happened to be a Phi Beta Kappa person. So she's got some brains too. And she's worked in the area of peace and dialogue organizations for the Alliance for Peace Building, Interfaith Youth Corps, and Sustained Dialogue Institute. Helen's going to share some insights and methods from Resetting the Table. She was the associate producer of their outstanding film called Purple, which really is used to get people to understand how to be equipped as leaders and communities with the tools and skills to address entrenched political and cultural divides. With that, take it over, Helen.
Thanks for that very kind introduction, Tom. It's such a pleasure to be here with the Rotary Network. I have been a very long time fan and follower of Rotary and only a new Rotarian. I recently joined Satellite Metro Rotary Club. So thank you for introducing me, Tom, in part from your efforts. And it's really a pleasure to be here and to be sharing our work with Rotary. I think your work is so important. So let me just begin by saying a few words about Resetting the Table and what we do. Resetting the Table works to build collaborative deliberation across political silos in American life. And we do this primarily by equipping community leaders and members with tools and skills, supporting communities to confront, honor, and learn from their political and ideological differences. And our founders and team are drawing from decades of experience in dialogue and mediation. One of our co-founders has over 20 years of experience in international conflict, earned her medals in the world of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and our other co-founder has a degree in sociology and retooled as a mediator, and they brought together their experiences in peace building and in mediation to develop a unique methodology and toolkit for achieving breakthroughs in communication in the face of our most entrenched political divides. Today, our programs have reached over 43,000 Americans and community leaders and members to speak, listen, and learn across moral and political disagreements. And we work with communities around the country in partnership, including some Rotary clubs, to undo some of the destructive impact that today's polarized politics are having on our society and communities. So as Jim and Tom already referred to, it's really no secret that we're living in really volatile times. There's a wide range of research that shows that American society is more divided and polarized and combative even than at any point since the Civil War. Americans increasingly live in echo chambers, living and encountering people only of their own political views. And it's becoming really rare that we see people, let alone really sustain friendships with people on the other sides of our political divides. And that certainly increased over the past several decades. This geographic segregation is only reinforced by the siloing that of the social media and the traditional media and in the news. And with all of that backdrop, it's really no surprise that for many of us in our daily lives, we're looking with bafflement and even contempt at those on other sides of divides. And this comes with some wide-ranging harms, this polarization. So I'll just touch on this. Some of you will have seen this in your lives and communities. It will be no surprise to know that one of the first harms we see is fractured relationships. A poll of the 2016 election found that thousands of people in all 50 states, a poll of thousands of people in all 50 states found that 16% stopped speaking to a family member or a close friend over politics after the 2016 election. And when you do the math, crunch the numbers here, that's the unraveling of over 50 million relationships. So in politically mixed families and communities, there's really this sense that our only choices are escalation or tiptoeing around things that matter to us, unfriending on Facebook, avoiding them altogether. But when they do come out, they often do so in ugly ways, and that causes the relational fallout that we've seen. And on a societal level, this breakdown of relationship can inch towards violence. National security experts rate political polarization among our greatest national security threats today. And we've seen this starting to lead, unfortunately, to violence in the US already, as we saw at the Capitol on January 6th, and we're seeing more frequently across the country. But it's not the only cost. Violence is certainly one of them, fractured relationship, but also something a little lighter, but still no less important, collective insight. We don't learn what we need to learn when we're only in echo chambers. Without communication across divides, we don't realize we're operating with blind spots and incomplete understanding, even false assumptions, both of each other and also the issues themselves, the things that are important to us. We often lose the kind of comprehensive understanding that only emerges when we connect with those who push us to see what we don't already see. And then the last is reduced problem solving. There's many ways to say this. For one, political dysfunction and division means that our representatives in elected government fail to represent any of us. The polarization is getting so bad that it is difficult to pass policies, with Congress people pressured to vote 100% along party lines when they would have been considered loyalists for only voting along party lines 70% of the time 20, 30 years ago. But it's not just in politics, it affects all kinds of collective problem solving. Local government, our businesses, our schools, church communities, Rotary groups, service clubs. For any of us who are advancing visions for ourselves and for our communities, it requires an ability to communicate and compel beyond our camps and to reach new allies alongside other strategies. So as I mentioned, I'm relatively new to the Rotary Network. I just joined a satellite club this year, but I think it's safe to say that Rotary can be a really powerful partner in addressing some of these wide-ranging costs. And in really restoring some of the connection that we've seen that we need across our differences. And I'll just name, in my experiences with Rotary, it's one of the rare places where I've encountered people who are organically coming together across political divides. We see this in churches, in synagogues, and faith communities, but also service clubs, people saying that because we share something common, we want to work towards, right, those Rotary's core principles, better world, better friendships. We can have an opportunity when we're organically coming together to address these divides, but often we're tiptoeing around them. So I want to just paint some snapshots from Resetting the Table's work, and then I'll offer some concrete central principles beneath what we do and give you a taste of what it looks like to delve into the political divides really directly in service and in seeking of a healthier version of our political conversation. So I've paused my slideshow and I want to invite you to close your eyes if you like, to help you visualize. I'm going to really try to help visualize some concrete snapshots from our work. Number one, imagine 22 college students hailing from progressive institutions like Brown, UC Berkeley, my own alma mater, Oberlin College, sitting down with rural Iowa and Wisconsin blue-collar workers, farmers, tradesmen, people who didn't and will not go to college. Imagine these students sitting in evangelical, Methodist, and Catholic churches, in bars and hospital cafeterias, Freemason lodges, talking to men and women wearing Make America Great Again hats, to hunters and waitresses, business owners, auto mechanics, stay-at-home moms, all kinds of people, really from any walk of life, everyday Americans and leaders alike. And picture these students training and building a muscle for how to listen deeply to each person sitting before them. Learning skills to excavate what matters to these people, even when the interviewees didn't hand their meeting over on a silver platter, but listening for clues and signposts, the core concerns, what really matters to you, what drives you, what concerns you. and as much as possible, disciplining themselves to hold their own assumptions and filters in check, to step into the lives and worldviews of the people on the other side of the table. Coming to understand better the moral matrices of people who are very, very different from themselves. What are the outcomes here? Many of the students described this experience that we led them through as life-altering, not because their views on the core issues, things like guns and immigration and abortion changed, but because their perception changed of the people who held diametrically opposed views to them on these issues. As one student put it at the time, I felt myself reacting my whole life to stereotypes of these views, but I'd never even heard the views themselves on their own terms, let alone met some of the people behind them. Picture a second snapshot now. These previously alienated leaders, the very people who these students had interviewed, themselves with differences, themselves on other sides of divides, participating in small groups engineered for diverse views, reconstructing what matters to each other, and openly discussing the issues that divide them. Many enter with fear and trepidation. They've never done this before. Their hackles are up. They don't know what's going to happen when they actually delve in, when they actually hit that button, talk about that thing that they've been avoiding for years. School teachers, business leaders, diversity scholars and theologians, conventional dairy and organic farmers, every persuasion of pastor and priest. Dedicating an entire day to listen deeply to each other's perspectives and concerns through guided exercises and skilled facilitation, discovering the intelligence and love that animates the other, and seeing the world through each other's eyes. What are some of the outcomes here? There are relational outcomes, agreements to call each other up rather than attack each other in the press next time a hot button issue arises, lunch dates, renewed collaboration among leaders who had no longer been on speaking terms before this event. Many reported growing to care for the needs and pain of those with whom they disagree, even though they still are on opposite sides of policy issues. And then there are learning takeaways. Leaders from across the political spectrum start to realize that their messaging had been ineffectual among the demographics that they were trying to reach, because participants are pushing each other to confront their respective blind spots. And sometimes a remarkable number of people report that their position shifted and that their thinking expanded through the process. Maybe their heart is in the same place, but the details, the nuances shift. And this is a final outcome, which is one of community cohesion. Many described that while they felt petrified to open this Pandora's box, multiple people will describe it as like, how could I even begin to touch politics? This is very scary to communities when it's the first time they open up the issue. While they were petrified at the beginning, they leave feeling strengthened by it. They feel braver. After 3 hours of meaningful dialogue, parties recommit to a sense of community bigger than themselves, not by having compromised or avoided their differences, but precisely because they delved into them, got to challenge each other, got to come through it and realize they can come out on the other side. So if your eyes are closed, I invite you to open them back up. This is something that we do, and it can feel uncomfortable. You might have even felt uncomfortable imagining yourself in one of these kinds of conversations. But I'm going to take you through some of the principles that enable us to have these conversations in a way that actually works. So scholars and practitioners of conflict have long observed that conflict produces general tendencies at both the interpersonal and societal levels. In the face of conflict, we have a tendency towards rigidity. We dig in, don't want to change our minds. We become the opposite of the receptive and flexible self, the people that we are when we're at ease, when we're happy, when we're not feeling threatened, when you imagine yourself on a really good day. Conflict brings out the opposite. And the other is self-absorption. When confronted with a threat, we tend to get closed off, impervious to the experience of the person sitting before us, unable to imagine their view, even if a moment before we were connected, and even when we love this person, when it's a friend or a family member. And polarized social conflict reproduces these tendencies writ large at a societal level. For example, we get confirmation bias and litmus tests for ideological purity. Those are some of the collective corollaries of rigidity, bringing that interpersonal to the societal. And then we get echo chambers, which is the collective corollary to self-absorption. I'm so ensconced in my own view that I really have a hard time in the midst of this polarized conflict, imagining how it could be seen differently by someone else. And the heart of our methodology at RTT is a series of interventions and tools that are designed to move parties from rigidity to flexibility and receptivity, and from self-absorption to connection and recognition. And collectively, we call these shifts stabilization. We train our facilitators and design processes that produce stability proactively and restore it when it's undermined. We don't just instruct parties to be empathetic, just say, be nicer, be kinder, active listening. Those are all values. That's what you learned from your parents and from your church community, from places that are doing values. But as conflict mediators, our job rather is through facilitators and processes to produce the conversational conditions in which empathy, humility, and people's best selves emerge organically, because they're feeling receptive, connected, and empowered through the processes that we're creating. So, of course, the million-dollar question is, how does one do this? How do we produce stability among parties that may have entered the room diametrically opposed, filled with trepidation or estrangement? And we've found, generally speaking, 3 vehicles to stability. I'll name that. We could dive into each of these and really go into some interactive workshops more about them. I encourage you, if you have questions, to write them down. We'll discuss more during the Q&A, but I'm just giving you a brief taster menu, if you will, an overview of the kinds of ways that we will produce stability in a conversation. The first is structure, and this looks like tools such as a go-around or ground rules. You may have seen conversation agreements in communities. Rotary has its own versions of meeting formats. There are lots of ways that structure can produce stability in a conversation. And an advantage of structure is it's easy to replicate. You can often create a written guide and not need intensive training of facilitators to make it work. But the disadvantage in our experience is that structure can produce hit and miss outcomes. When there's really charged differences in a room, the things that are really core to who you are, there's less a risk of escalation with structure than of participants just tiptoeing around the issue. They want to hold themselves back, not really come to full expression, not fully take each other in. And then the other disadvantage of structure is that you often have the experience of only the likely suspects come into the conversation. It's hard to get people to come and feel like, well, I have something to say, I'm a minority voice, because they just expect that the structure won't really create the conditions in which their voice will be taken in by the other. Another tool we use is communication capacity building. And this is training participants in communication skills. So this looks like active listening, asking better questions, and teaching people, just everyday people, to themselves apply communication skills while investigating their differences. And lastly is skill facilitation. And this is the most surefire route that we've found to achieving the aforementioned shifts from rigidity to recognition, from self-absorption to recognition of the other, even while addressing things that are painful, scary, and difficult. And there's great value in each of these options. We use all 3 of them at Resetting the Table, but we primarily focus on the latter 2, sort of for the reasons that I mentioned, and really equipping communities with skills and trained practitioners to be able to use and make use of structures effectively. Because people, no matter where they are, if they feel confident, they feel that they have the skill, or that there's someone in the room who has the skill to handle those differences well, they're much more likely to open up and take advantage of the opportunity to investigate their differences in a healthy way. So I'd like to next throw out a principle that is really core, and it runs through all of our training and everything we do. And more than anything, this is the principle that we're teaching people to embody when we do the communication building and the skill facilitation trainings. And that's the principle that we call directness, going towards the heat of our differences. We borrow heavily from a school of mediation called transformative mediation. And this observes, and this may feel paradoxical, but we found it to be true, that when core differences are in the room, the things that really animate us, that in our gut we feel as moral and necessary and important, and we have differences here, we produce greater stability by going towards the heat of these differences rather than by sidestepping them or by directing participants to find common ground. And this feels really counterintuitive. In our normal lives, we often try to steer clear of differences. And I've already mentioned tiptoeing around or dodging the issue. And there's the aphorism, don't talk politics or religion at the dinner table. And many of us never see examples of conflict being engaged well. We're only ever seeing it escalating and exploding. So it's hard to imagine that you can really have a healthy conversation about political divides when there's real ideological diversity in the room. But when polarization gets entrenched and systemic, there's often no getting around the fact that when differences aren't engaged at all, they return again and again in destructive ways. And there are times when encounters across differences can feel hollow and even dissatisfying, and in some cases almost manipulative if the crucial differences are circled around rather than discussed directly. But what we found is that as long as we're able to capture the way each party sees differences as they see it, going towards the heat, naming direct differences among parties clearly and directly disarms the potentially destructive charge of the disagreement. And this is partly because that once we've named a difference, we said, this is where we disagree, it gives us something to talk about, something shared that we can explore and think through as partners and illuminate different dimensions and lenses on the issues, even solutions. And it makes parties in the conversation say, oh, like, I see what the conversation is about. It's not just that you're a conservative and that I'm a liberal. We disagree. And this is an example of one of our skills, naming the difference. We disagree about when life begins in the womb. Let's talk about that. We disagree about whether or not firearms can possibly be safe. Let's talk about that. We found again and again that groups often get to a more robust sense of commonality, shared interest, collaboration, and even just basic rehumanization when they've fearlessly gone through the differences and come out the other side together. So I'm going to ask you to imagine with me again the role that Rotary could play here. Rotarians come from all kinds of backgrounds and political and ideological views. But what we share is this intention, the guiding principles. We share the four-way test, these aspirations of who we want to be and how we want to show up in our communities. And imagine what Rotary could do if every Rotarian had the skills to turn even our sharpest political divides into opportunities to build goodwill and better friendships. Imagine the benefit to society if we could fearlessly go toward the heat of our differences and journey into what the other side has to teach us, to see what they see and emerge with a better grasp on the challenges facing our communities. We would emerge with wiser solutions to shared problems and stronger relationships that would allow us to implement them. So let's turn now to some ways to operationalize this vision. I'm just going to introduce 3 of RTT's core strategies, and this is all intended mainly as inspiration and brainstorming. We have our way of doing it organizationally, and there are lots of different ways that different organizations and groups that are addressing polarization plug in. But here are 3 that we use. One is training norm shapers and multipliers. We train people who have the trust and buy-in of their communities, the people who are positioned to model and shape the national narrative. And this can look like all kinds of people: Pulitzer journalists, Hollywood producers, mega church pastors, congressional staffers, CEOs, activists. These are just a few of the examples of multipliers. I certainly think Rotary leaders can be in this category. And what we do is aim to equip people who have the influence in their communities, who are leaders in their communities, to have the tools and strategies to transform political divides, to open up these conversations in ways that are more likely to maximize the likelihood that when political divides arise, the conversation happens well and can go towards the heat in a way that's healthy. We also design and facilitate forums with skilled facilitators and carefully structured processes. And our goal when we do this is to forge courageous discussion on issues that really matter to communities. So when there is a community that is coming apart around a particular issue, maybe it's a synagogue that is having a disagreement about what their policy towards Israel ought to be, or a small community that has an influx of new community members who have different politics from the people who've lived there for generations. We help and support communities with skilled facilitators to have the conversation that most needs to happen, figure out what are the hot button issues, where is the community's need really lying, and how can we have that conversation in a healthy way. And then lastly is depolarizing media content. And this is actually what brought me to Rotary. Tom mentioned this earlier. We produced and disseminated Purple, a short film that captures really diverse people. Actually, this very discussion forum that I introduced as one of my snapshots earlier in this conversation, people from rural Iowa and Wisconsin, everyday Americans, going toward the heat of their differences directly while supported by a skilled facilitator, and really coming to understand and humanize people on other sides of divides. And one of the reasons we use film is to build recognition and empathy and support new storylines on a much wider scale than we can just by bringing facilitators into a room together. So let's talk for a minute about some things that we can do, everyday people, the wider public, Rotarians. One is using the film. I mentioned already that structured processes are one of the the benefit to them is that they are replicable, and the shortcoming is that it's hard to get these conversations to really address the hottest issues. And as I've already said, addressing the hottest issues is a necessary component to overcoming the most entrenched divisions. But through film, the participants themselves don't have to bring those issues into the room. You can have the skilled facilitator do so on film for the participants and then practice the skill of capturing and understanding the perspectives of characters in the film without having to have a skilled facilitator present in the room of people discussing the film. So this is an opportunity to take and leverage the expert facilitation and really share it and start to build and practice those skills, even if you haven't gone through a 6-month-long mediation training. So we have a robust discussion guide along with the film that you're welcome to use if you'd like to. Tom has seen it. I'm happy to share with you. And this is really our lowest hanging fruit way to do something to just start to build the skill of going toward the heat of political divides if you don't have the time and capacity to fully bring in deep training to your community. Another is just to contribute resources. And I don't just mean the obvious ones. Of course, time and money are the biggest obstacles to operationalizing this work on the ground. But it's more than that. It's also your commitment to being brave, to staying in relationship, even and especially with people who disagree with you. A lot of people these days are drawing their red lines very close to themselves and saying, I don't want to stay in relationship with this person or that person, this view or that view. And of course, everyone should draw their own boundaries where they will. I'm not disagreeing with that. But when that has become a societal norm, when we're all doing that all the time, that's what leads to the kind of societal damage and relationship breakdown and societal fabric fraying that can really escalate into the kinds of damaging patterns that I talked about at the beginning of our conversation. And actually, because we have someone here from India, I'll mention that part of the research that informs and underlies our work is a study that was done in communities in India that found that one of the single greatest factors that contributed to where there was intergroup violence and where there wasn't was the presence of civic associations and groups that bring people together to have contact across divides. So when I say your resources, I actually also mean your relationships. Staying in a relationship with people who disagree with you and continuing to say, you know what, we might see this differently, but we have the intention and the aspiration to stay in relationship and to do something important together and to continue to work together towards our shared aims, whether that's just friendship or being in a Rotary Club together, whatever the case may be. And then the last one I want to mention is just spreading the word that this work of having conversations across charged political differences is possible and desirable. One of the biggest obstacles towards more people engaging across political divides is just the belief that it's not possible. But it does work, and I can tell you, I see it all the time. Every day I hear new stories of red and blue Americans, urban and rural, Black and white people who say they never could have thought that they'd empathize with someone on that side of a divide. And I really do see this with every swath of America. Every time I give a talk, someone is thinking to themselves, oh, but like, what about this group? Like, aren't they unlikely to come to the room? And that group is different for everyone. But there's almost always someone who will come into the room who has that view. People are amazing and nuanced and flexible. And just as an example of one that happened recently, I was in a facilitated conversation with a very diverse group of people. And in the course of the conversation, there was this liberal, gay, Jewish man who was in conversation with a devout conservative Christian. And he was very skeptical of the process going into this. They're like, how can we possibly do this? But in the course of the conversation, he was like, you know, I've had a lot of negative experiences with the church. And I have a lot of stereotypes about Christians, but I feel like for the first time, I might be able to love and be friends with Christians again. And that's the kind of outcome that we do see every day. So just spreading the word that this can happen, it's possible for it to happen well, and restoring some of the hope that there is something that can be done is another surefire thing that every single person can do to contribute towards making this work more possible. So I want to leave ample time for some conversation and Q&A and back and forth. So I'll just finish up here and say that in all of our work, really what Resetting the Table does is quest to clarify and just shine a light on where differences are, with the understanding that this and doing this is what opens and shifts parties from that self-absorption and rigidity into recognition and receptivity, and empowers communities to be able to face their differences fearlessly, and empowers communities to find improbable connection and fresh thinking and collaboration and even empathy, and very rare but still possible cases, changed minds in the face of our most entrenched political divisions. So with that, let's have a conversation. I'll stop my screen share. Thank you all for being here and listening to me speak.
Hi, Helen, Dave here. So you mentioned the movie Purple. Are you referring to The Color Purple?
Yes, so The Color Purple is a book and a movie, but that is not what I'm referring to. The movie Purple is a metaphor for red and blue together coming to become purple. So it's a movie that was produced and created by Resetting the Table and an Emmy Award-winning production firm. I'll drop a link in the chat. It'll just take me a minute to pull it up. It's great. It's on YouTube. It's a 20-minute documentary that just captures one conversation among many that we facilitated in rural Wisconsin and Iowa.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, when searching for the movie Purple on the web, it's just overwhelming. The color purple is all that shows up.
Yeah, I dropped it in the chat.
Oh, thank you.
But if you Google Resetting the Table Purple, then the correct one. And Dave, this is, parts of this could be used in RILA. It's a very powerful film.
Thank you.
We have a very active in our area.
I know that Sarah Reed, who's a leader in the Satellite Read Club that I just recently joined and has done, she's also a law professor. She's done screenings of Purple in all kinds of audiences, including many different Rotary contexts. So if anyone wants someone to talk to who's done it before and is in a similar spot to you, she's a great person to talk to and has really found creative ways to use the film in all kinds of contexts to bring this work forward. And
Jeff Ellis from Fort Collins has a question.
Yeah, Helen, thank you so much. That was a great presentation. Really appreciate it. As a mediator myself, I certainly understand the power of entering a community and transforming the community through these kinds of approaches in session. My question is there any programmatic approach to political leadership and engaging political leadership, which often drives messaging down, as well as social media, that pretty much exacerbates the problem dramatically? It's an easy forum for people to drop something on it and not to have any consequence about it or accountability for it. So I'm just curious, as the movement is around the community itself, as I understood it, which I totally agree with, what about from the top down and also including social media?
I also see it. I'm going to read the question that just came in through the chat before I answer you to see if there's any connection between the two. One moment. Okay, I'll answer your question first, Jeff. So there was two pieces, the political leaders and the social media. I'll speak to political leaders first. We draw heavily from the theory of a scholar called John Paul Lederach. He's a leading scholar of conflict transformation around the world and has worked in lots of conflict zones. And one of the things that he outlines is that while certainly political leaders have a lot to say and influence in conflict, they're as influenced by the grassroots as vice versa, and they're also captured in a sense by the grassroots. The political leaders who are in the public eye have very limited ability really to change their mind to interact with the other side, because in high conflict scenarios, what you often see is that in escalated conflict, the very act of meeting with the other side is seen by their supporters as a betrayal of who they are and why I elected you. So strategically, this is part of the focus on middle tier leaders. So for example, working with congressional staffers rather than Congress people, because congressional staffers can meet informally together and then inform the decision-making of their leaders in a way that you can't always do with the people at the helms of the public eye. And while the approach is less dramatic and less flashy in the long run, by shaping megachurch pastors and by shaping activist leaders, the kinds of people who aren't forced by the way that they hold power and influence to continue in a particular position, we're much more likely to be able to shape large swaths of people with the skills, and therefore be able to create the grassroots and the conditions that really hold together social cohesion. So there's more than one cause and driver of polarization, but part of our theory of change is that, while the incentives that are existing on our elected officials that are forcing them into more and more extreme perspectives and views, the counter to that isn't to try to change the politicians, but to shift the public perspective and public view enough that their extreme positions and the what's the word for it? That essentially we are creating a national norm that even when I really disagree with you, I'll stay in conversation with you. And once that becomes the national norm, you'll still see the positions in Congress, you'll still see people with these positions, but the behavior and the attitude are what we're seeking to shift.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. I'm seeing some questions about the training. I'll, instead of the chat, just because it'll take a while for me to do the chat, I wonder if Vasanti, would you ask your question aloud if you're okay with that?
Yeah. The first question is, because peace and conflict are related emotionally, would you think that after an intervention, people become a little bit more peaceful, but however, they might get back to conflicts? So what would be the focus for sustaining any of the changes happening at that level? The second question is, what are the dividers that you have seen? Because that was mentioned in the slide. And if you can take up one divider and say how that was addressed, that would help. Thank you.
So on sustaining change, this is funnily enough part of our origin story. I mentioned that one of our co-executive directors worked for many years in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And one of the things that she observed is you can bring people together to have contact across very, very sharp differences. But when they come back to their own communities, there's often nothing to, like, people want to share that experience, but their own home community is not receptive. And so this is part, again, of the reason that we focus on communication skills. So if I've been transformed, I mentioned some of the interns who came with us to Wisconsin and Iowa, many of them were transformed by the experience of just really delving into this place that was so different from their upbringing and backgrounds. But we didn't just have them have the contact experience, we also trained them in communication skills. So they came and learned and practiced the communication skills in relationship with very conservative people, very rural people who they'd never met before. And in the process of doing that, they also learned the skills to be able to go back home and share their experience with the people back home and reflect them. So they all go home and say, you haven't had this transformative experience that I had, but I now am equipped with dialogue skills and communication skills to get you to hear my version of the world that has been shaped and formed by the experience that I had. So this is one of the things that's stickier about having communication skills rather than just process. And the other thing is about working towards institutional change. This is one of the reasons we work closely with community partners. So working not only with one group, but actually working with an entire synagogue or an entire nonprofit organization or a regional area, working really closely with leaders and multipliers to build programs that are greater than the sum of their parts. So an example of this is a program that we're doing currently with faith leaders across the American South. So we have pastors and rabbis and people who are in interfaith groups, but really are in very opposite sides of divides. So some are very conservative communities, some are very liberal communities. We have an evangelical church, we have a Black Baptist church, we have a synagogue, people who are really in, even though their own religious communities are siloed, they're together learning the skills of opening up nuance and dialogue and conversation within their communities, and they're doing so alongside each other. So by building at that level of the multipliers and the shapers of their institutions, you're creating a norm and an institutional culture that's saying, this is something that we are doing and valuing as our community. Our church, our synagogue is a place where these conversations happen and happen well, and where minority views and perspectives are welcomed. And when you have that as a part of a norm, it becomes much stickier and easier because it's not just a subgroup in the community, it's part of a culture of institutional change and of regional change that's being committed to over the long term. Bill, did you want to ask a question?
Yeah, I'm thinking of Highlander and the training that went on for civil rights workers, discipline in the face of abuse, practice, role playing, clear rules about decorum. Do you get into that with your training?
Yeah, that's a great question. It depends is the answer. So in many of our trainings, our goal isn't to train people to be nonviolent activists. Our goal is simply to say, wherever you are, our introductory training, learn the communication skills. So you might continue to advocate for your position. We're not in a frontal way saying you should be seeking common ground or you should be ending polarization. That's not what we are advocating in most of our workshops. We're saying behaviorally, take on the communication skills. In our most advanced trainings, where we're dealing with people who have committed to being practitioners and facilitators, more so, our goal isn't to build a nonviolent movement. I think civil rights is a very beautiful example of how the training and the skills and the discipline are a necessary component to really pursuing a form of nonviolence and of peace that is very challenging to live up to, but it certainly informs our approach. And so with our facilitators, it's a less extreme version, but we will practice with them, okay, what are the views and perspectives that you're likely to hear as a facilitator that are going to be triggering to you? What's going to get your hackles up? What's going to make it hard for you to really be present with a participant in the room? And they do a lot of practice. One of our program director just today, her experience and background is in trauma therapy, and she was talking a little bit about insights from exposure therapy, just getting exposure to things that scare you, as how that informs our methodology and our approach with facilitators. So there are a lot of different things that inform our approach, and I think there's a lot of commonalities with some of the practices from civil rights, even though it's not explicitly a part of our training.
Thanks.
Thank you. Paulette had a question?
I did. Thank you very much. I really enjoy the concept of this, and I see that it is with the proper training, it is very useful. I could also see it without the proper training becoming a train wreck. My question is, because Rotary is non-political and non-religious, I'm questioning, how does it become reconciled with this kind of a direct approach to these issues? Because it is the issues of religion and politics that often separate so many human beings. And what then, I'm sorry, excuse me. And then further, the question is, what's the safe environment for this conversation?
Yeah. So first of all, really fantastic question. Thank you for bringing it up. This is something that isn't always the case for organizations like Rotary, but can sometimes be the case, is a shift in lens. The goal here isn't to become political, it's to make it possible to address political differences. So this is subtle, but it's not about advocating for any particular view. It's about forging, we often call this a meeting ground, like a welcoming environment. So it's related to the safe space question too. It's not, so and this is something that faith communities that we work with often worry about. You hear all the time, like, well, we shouldn't talk politics in church. We should have a politically neutral pulpit. This is something that people often are challenged by, though, because many people feel that their religion informs their politics, and that their politics are informed by and a necessary part of how they express their religious views. So one of the things that I would say is it is possible for central institutions. I think the example that's coming to mind is like a JCRC, the Jewish Communal Relations Councils that we work with. Their role is not to be political on any particular view, but increasingly we work with them and they say, what we want to do, and part of our aspiration is to create a meeting ground where different swaths of the Jewish community can explore their differences. And we're going to create, we ourselves are not going to come out with political perspectives, but what we are going to do is to commit to building the infrastructure so that the many swaths of our community and all of their political views, when it does intersect with the things that are our business and the JCRC issues facing the Jewish community, we're able to address political differences internally really effectively and well. So we could talk more, Paulette, about exactly like how one does this. It does require a little bit of institutional reckoning. Like, do we see ourselves as, do we see this as a part of our mission, of our goal? And the answer might be no. But I think for some organizations, and this is really where, what I mean when differences return and start to boil up, is that there is an opportunity sometimes if there is sort of we call this avoidance 2.0, like we're just sort of dancing around the political issue. It's like under the table, we know it's there, but we don't want to talk about it. But then, every time such and such issue comes up, suddenly someone has to leave the room because they just can't be here anymore. When those things are boiling up and you're starting to see that, well, maybe we do need to address this, that's the time that I would say it's especially helpful to say, like, this might be part of our mission. Like, we want to address this because it's harder to stay focused on the community service work that we do and to reach people who might help support our core mission if we're able to address these differences head on. So I would say the goal isn't about a political perspective, but about reaching clarity, reaching understanding, mutual understanding across political divides. And something we often say is, like, understanding is not agreement. So you don't have to agree here. And the goal is not pushing people towards agreement. The goal is saying, okay, we're going to get to the point where we understand one another. And then if we decide, you know what, that's all we can and want to do, it'll still push us further in our relationship. And just one more thought here. I often think about this as having like a good friend who will tell you when you're wrong. Like, that's sort of the goal here. It's not about us becoming political. It's about us being able to talk about the hard stuff well.
Thank you.
I'm just going down the list. Looks like Bob Rose had a question.
Yes, I just see if you have any examples of this work being done through Rotary. Our Rotary meetings are usually, the speaker is only 30 minutes. There's only so much you could do in that time period with this kind of work, I'm sure. So just any thoughts or examples that you have of Rotary actually working with these concepts?
Yeah. I mentioned the purple film. I definitely think that's the easiest thing that Rotary clubs can take on. It may not look exactly like a typical event, but I've done screenings of purple now for 2 different Rotary clubs, and it's more of a 90-minute process. It's more interactive, so it may or may not feel like it fits, and so feel free to say, no, that's not really us, but I encourage you to check it out and see if you could see it fitting, because it's sort of the first and easiest way. And the other is just really about like intention, like being able to say to people, we are going to have an intention of, as part of our principles, staying in a relationship when these divides do come up. And that might look like joining organizations like not just Resetting the Table, but the People's Supper, other organizations that are working to deal with political divides. It might just be about like sort of sharing this as an aspiration. So much of my experience of Rotary, and again, I'm very new to the network, but it feels like the structure of a poem, almost like how poetry is beautiful because of its structure. Rotary provides this beautiful structure that enables and supports people to be more in alignment with their values. And so part of what I'm saying is that the aspiration to say, well, we're going to be a part of the partnership of overcoming American polarization and see where that fits in. Yeah, I guess that's what I'm thinking. But, you know, I think Rotary is already doing this. I had an experience where I did a presentation of this with a Rotary Club in Missouri, and it was one of the most politically diverse groups I've ever been a part of. Like, we are really geographically segregated today in America across political divides, and that has been less true in my experience in Rotary groups. So I think just saying, like, we're going to continue to do what we do best, bringing people together in service in spite of our differences. And then if our differences come up, we'll address them and we'll continue that aspiration. Like, I think that's a big part of it too.
Thank you much. Appreciate it.
Yeah. Jim Halderman.
Yeah, first of all, I love the idea of dragging the elephant out of the corner and address real issues. Another interesting thing I see is that people tend to identify with their beliefs as to who they are. They become emotionally attached to their beliefs and connect with, I am a Christian, or I am, rather than my belief is. Can you address how you deal with some of those issues?
It's a very deep question. One of the activities we often do when we open up a conversation in a community is called life maps. So instead of going directly into the political conversation or addressing the issues that are dividing a community, we start out by asking people, what are the moments from your life that informed and shape your political and moral lens? And we often ask people to just list bullets, or we might even have them draw. Like, often we'll say, you know, this feels a little silly. You might feel like you're back in kindergarten, but bear with us. Like, let's try drawing this out just to activate the visual portion of people's brains. And what we do is we start out by having people learning to listen to each other's core lenses rather than, so you're still addressing the heat of the issue, and we are going to go towards the heat, but we start by really getting to know what's the core thing animating one another. So we aren't necessarily going to tell someone, I actually don't think we're ever going to tell someone, you know, separate your identity from your belief or separate your position from who you are. That's not right for everyone. Sometimes that would feel false. And that's part of what the costs are of some approaches to dialogue, is to, like, asking people to put aside part of who they are in order to be part of the conversation. But what we will do is say, okay, here's where you are. We're going to give recognition to that. We're going to welcome all of it, including those moments from your life, those things that shaped you, into the room. And we're going to ask you to be able, not necessarily to like it, but to be able to say and see and give recognition that someone else had different experiences. Someone else is in a totally different place, that they had a moral and political upbringing and lens that shaped them and brought them somewhere else, and that you're going to come into recognition with one another. And that's really the goal. So it's not to shift that. If you're a facilitator, we might say, there are different standards and levels of training that they go through, but most people are able to do this, even if they don't really see a separation between their politics and their core beliefs. Holly.
I was just thinking that wondering, I guess, just a curious question, if one of the difficulties for your facilitators is drawing us away from our results-oriented perspective, our society, you know, like how many times as you're going through this process, do you get done and people say, okay, now what are we supposed to do? Or what now? Or what happens next? Or what are we supposed to do with this? When in essence, it's the process that is the most important, right? Am I getting that right? It's walking through the process is more important than, okay, now we're going to go do this.
Yeah, I'd say it's a both and. I think that because we are mediators and facilitators, and that's our role, it's really essential that we aren't pushing people towards any particular view. What we're doing is creating the conditions for people to come to their own terms about what is their lens. We empower people to say, what is my opinion? And we do some educational work too. and this is our approach when we do education, is to not push people towards a particular viewpoint, but to say, here are all of the viewpoints. Can we capture each of them on their own terms and just learn what they are, and then let people and communities come to their own conclusions. So I think, yeah, it's a both and. We aren't necessarily asking for results, but the results emerge organically. Like with the group that we worked with in rural Iowa and Wisconsin, we just asked them to understand one another. And then organically, we had people who had never imagined being in the same room together, going fishing together after the conversation, right? So it's like those relationships are often very emergent. And it, you know, I was strategy and impact officer previously to being assistant director, and measuring and results of the work are challenging when they are so emergent. So you happen to hit on something I could talk about for an entire 2 hours, but I think that the general gist of this is that the process is part of the goal, and it leads to these results that are just like off on their own.
Thank you.
Yeah. Gary Kahn. Gary, still here?
Yes, I'm sorry, I'm unmuting. I wonder whether you could just give some concrete examples. I know that you just tried to address the fact that these are emergent results and it's hard to, but just give a couple of examples of how your process resulted in what you would consider a really satisfying experience that you've been a part of.
Yeah. The one that's coming to mind is a process we led for a synagogue called Mount Zion. I won't name exactly where because, you know, of their privacy, but we, thank you, Sandra, and thank you, Vasanthi, for being with us. So I think this will be my last question, just out of respect for everyone's time, but we, the synagogue was really challenged around whether or not after the escalation in Israel in May, they should continue to have a "We Support Israel" sign in front of the synagogue. And the synagogue was very divided around this issue. They didn't know what they would do. And there were questions about the synagogue breaking up over this, people leaving the community. And they brought us in to facilitate a dialogue process and guide them through, how do we decide whether or not to have this flag in front of our synagogue? And I think the decision they ultimately came to after, you know, we led them through multiple programs, so multiple workshops, including skills training, processes, having town square conversations with the skilled facilitator, just really delving into the heat of the issues that were underlying why and how this was so important to the community. And they came up with a new flag. I think it says, "Justice, justice, we shall pursue," which is something, it's a phrase that's very laden with Jewish textual and scriptural meaning. And they just decided, you know, for some members of their community, that was a disappointment. They thought it was really important to keep the "We Support Israel" flag. For other members, you know, it was still a disappointment on the other side. They thought that we should say something explicitly condemning Israel's actions after the escalation that happened in May. But ultimately, they had to choose to do something. And the result was that every community member felt that they had been heard and considered. And often that is a huge part of what we're doing, is saying, you know, you're not necessarily, like, when a community does have to make a decision, you might not feel that that reflected you, but you did feel respected through the process. You weren't just dismissed out of hand just because of who you are or what you believed. And that often is the difference between a community that's gone through a process where they delve into the heat of the issue before coming to a decision versus one that just makes the decision. They might have reached the same outcome in the end, but the tenor and the way it feels for the community is often very different. And that's often what is able and empowers communities to stay in relationship when these issues are so heated for them.
Let's do one more question, Helen. And I believe down the list is Greg.
Well, this is pretty simple. I just wanted to ask how many Purple meetings have taken place, and have they all sort of come out like the one you see in the movie? We've seen the movie on our committee here, so.
Great. You know, not all are exactly like the one in the movie. One of the questions, I don't know if this is the question exactly you're asking, is like, well, doesn't it escalate? Like, doesn't it get out of hand sometimes? Like, they can't all look like that. I would say, like, often I have almost never seen real escalation happen at a resitting table process. When it does happen, I mean, we train facilitators in troubleshooting, like things that, like what to do if a participant has been offended or hurt, what to do if someone says something that's like really interpreted as offensive to someone else who's in the room. So we train people proactively and what to do, like really concretely, and they practice for many, many hours on what to do when that happens. And even, you know, in my 5 years at Resitting the Table, I've only seen it happen once where the conversation almost got out of hand and the facilitator was able to bring it back. And we do a lot of work with follow up with communities to say like, okay, like if something went wrong in a conversation, like where did it go wrong, and to really bring people back into relationship. Is this the question you're asking? It looks like maybe is there?
No, that is, well, I was just asking, I mean, the answer could have been they all come out the same, but.
Yeah, I mean, they don't come out the same, but they do have, like, how do I put this? This, you know, we use the language of maximizing the likelihood that you'll get a really good conversation. And I think that's right. A bad conversation at Resitting the Table is more often like everyone comes and they're like, you know what? We thought this was going to be terrible, but we actually are all much closer than we thought we were. And so we don't have as much to disagree about as we thought.
Well, that's why I was wondering if you did one in Colorado yet.
We've done them in Colorado. Actually, we worked with the ADL in Colorado to do a series was it Denver? It might have been Denver. I don't remember where, but we do these all over the country. We've reached directly 42,000 people in all 50 states. Indirectly, it's probably many more than that. And I really could not count the number of programs that we run. I try to. It was part of my former role before I was promoted to be in charge of counting all of them. And it's just very, actually, like, people take these tools and they just start using them right away in their lives. And so it's very hard to fully quantify the impacts. But the gist of this is that people are way more powerful than I think we realize in the face of differences. Like, we're able to do this. And one of the patterns of conflict that I didn't mention is weakness. Like, we often feel just like weak in a conflict, like I am not my best self, and it's uncomfortable. And part of what the facilitator is doing is like teaching people, like, you actually can do this. Like, you have the ability and the capacity to hear and listen to someone who's on the other side of a divide. That this experience, in most cases, and it's possible that it will escalate. There is real violence that happens in the world, but we're getting people to at a really early stage of escalation. And it is most people, most of the time, want this to go well. People don't like polarization. They don't like the shattered relationships and families. And so when they have a facilitator, someone who is there and saying like, I got you, we're going to do this and it's going to go well, it's amazing what people will be able to do.
Well, and if they agree to participate in one of these, presumably they're recognizing a need for, better communication. Yeah. So they would come in at least with a hope that this would work. So that'll help.
Yeah. Thank you all. I'm sorry that I have to cut off the discussion because I love answering your questions. And
it's going to go on all night. We are so thankful. We thank you so much. After hearing you, Helen, I think maybe there is hope yet.
Oh, thank you so much.
So keep it up and keep building the hope.
Yeah, and feel free, anyone, to reach out to me if you want to continue the conversation about whether it's Purple or broadly bringing this work to Rotary. This is something that I'm passionate about, clearly, and I'm here on late at night, my time. So please reach out and I'll drop my email in the chat.
Great, thank you. Thank you. We can use that and we'll watch the movie Purple. So next month is going to be a little unique one. It's going to be a true forum, a true forum for discussion. Next month is entitled the Ontological Forum for Peace. What our Peace Committee knows is the attendees to these events are very knowledgeable, very curious, very inspired, and full of knowledge and information. Prior to next month, I would ask each of you to send me either in your registration or on an email, your biggest question on peace. What do you see as the biggest challenge? What is your biggest question? What is your one biggest aha around peace? Send that to me. And if we get 20 to 30 of them, I will put them in a piece of paper. No names will be attached. We will draw one at a time from a jar and discuss them amongst ourselves. The knowledge in this group is phenomenal, and we all want to learn from this group. Also, the Peace Committee wants to learn what's important. What are the values? What are you curious about? So send us your biggest, toughest questions, because the audience here in front that you are all looking at, the answers are within all of us. And so next week, we will draw the answers from all of us. To do that, first, send me all your questions. What are your biggest issues? What are your biggest concerns? What are your biggest thoughts around peace? Next week, for the ontological forum for discussion. It's a little stretch of the term, but not
Next month, Jim, next month.
Oh, there I go again. Next month. Thank you, Tom Baker. And again, Helen, we want to thank you so very much for taking the time and coming and join us.
Thank you, Helen.
And with that, I bid you all adieu.